this a case of thief shouting thief? Or is this a neighbor stressed out by swarms of police officers? This is Roy Coons Jr.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Donald Coons Jr., guilty of second-degree murder.
In 2017, he was arrested and charged with the brutal murder of a 12-year-old girl called Yhoana Arteaga. He had a history of arrests and run-ins with the law, but nothing was half as bad as murder. Now, he was under scrutiny, but nothing made any sense. There were no witnesses or evidence connecting the two. What Coons didn't know was that just before her tragic death, Johanna texted her mother, and in one of her messages, there was a clue that would glue the whole case together. Watch on to find out the tragic story of Yhoana Arteaga. Our story begins in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. It's a tiny city home to some 17,000 people. It's not a bustling cultural scene like Nashville, but it's usually pretty peaceful and welcoming. Unfortunately, Goodlettsville wasn't that kind to Yhoana Arteaga. She was born in 2005 to Patricia Vasquez and Marlon Arteaga, but when Johanna was very little, Patricia and Marlon split up. She would go on to take her 3 children and move to a trailer park home. So Johanna grew up with Patricia and her 2 siblings, Oscar, who was 2 years younger, and Jocelyn, who was 2 years older. Patricia was born in Mexico and worked as an architect there. But after she came to the United States and became a mother of 3, her life changed quite a bit. She dedicated most of her time to her kids, and she strived to be an excellent mom. She supported their dreams, as difficult as they were. Johanna was a computer nerd, as well as a passionate karate fighter. In fact, she was passionate about many things, and Patricia was very proud of her for this. With this attitude, she was certain her daughter would achieve greatness, no matter the career that she would choose. But Johanna wouldn't get to choose any career. On August 10th, 2017, Johanna was home alone. She'd broken her ankle skating, and she was in crutches. She didn't want to go out with her mom and siblings that day, so she would just stay home and watch a movie in her room. Her family wasn't gone that long. This is what makes what happened next all the more blood-chilling. That evening at 6:45 p.m., 911 received a really distressing call.
911, what is the address of your emergency?
Hi. My sister, we just got home. She went home alone. They killed my sister. I don't know what to do.
Jocelyn couldn't even think about her home address. Her mother, even less.
Hold on, stay on the line with me, okay? We're gonna get somebody to fix that.
The message was clear though. Someone had died, and the police had to get to their house right away.
Listening to 911 tapes and, working with them in a number of homicide cases during my time as a prosecutor. The pain of a mother sounds the same in no matter what language you hear it. That there's just a certain tone, and once you hear it, it sits with you.
When the officers arrived at the scene, they understood the desperate cries of Patricia and her oldest daughter, Jocelyn. Johanna had been bound to her own bed, beaten, stripped, and partially undressed, all in the matter of a few hours, while her family was away. Imagine finding your daughter or your sister that way in your own home.
Johanna's murder was one of the more brutal cases that I've reviewed. It happened in a location that I think that most 12-year-olds would feel safe and secure, and that's in their home. When this child was found, she was found with a martial arts belt wrapped around her neck, not once, but twice. It was secured in the back with a double knot.
Johanna had been with the very belt she prided herself on. It was her achievement. And it was wrapped so tightly around her that blood vessels had popped in her eyes, face, and neck.
Whoever did this took their time. When this child's earbuds were recovered, they were soaked in blood. These devices were in her ear, perhaps, as she is being checked out. She didn't see this guy coming.
Johanna's pants were pulled down. Her attacker wanted to violate her, but changed his mind at the last moment.
There was a bit of disrobing that went on here. Anytime that you have the appearance of an event that might have a sexual connotation, you're always going to do assault kit.
Johanna's death was shocking, outrageous, and deeply upsetting to everyone who knew her. Her family was in shambles. Both her siblings had seen her the way she was left, and it was a sight that would scar them for life. But they couldn't grieve just yet. Not until the killer was caught. The first thing the police did, like in many other cases, was try to narrow down the suspect pool by going around the neighborhood. First, Johanna was too young to have any boyfriends, enemies, or people with a motive to kill her. So the investigators looked for people with a criminal record in the trailer park. And voila! There was a man with a 30-year-old record living just 2 doors down, Roy Coons Jr. The first interview was not a suspicious one. The officers were simply going door to door asking if anyone had seen anything that day. When they encountered Roy, he seemed like your average next-door neighbor.
How you doing? Doing well. You live here? Yeah. You been here pretty much all day, or? I've been in and out. You never saw anything unusual, strange, nothing stood out to you, like, I've never seen that guy before? No.
If it were any other neighbor, that would have been the end of their encounter with the police. But the detectives knew his history, and they couldn't just dismiss him from the start.
This is a man who has been arrested 102 times. And his first arrest started when he was 19 years old. In 1999, he was convicted of his 3rd DUI guilty. 2001, he was guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2006, he's guilty of 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. 2010, guilty of aggravated burglary.
Roy Coons Jr. was first arrested in 1991, and his last arrest was months away from Johanna's murder. Most of his arrests were parole violations, so it was pretty clear he wouldn't just stop. His life was a life of crime, and he showed no intention to curb his ways. What's worse, do you see how his crimes got progressively worse with time? From DUI to aggravated burglary. That's a pretty nasty road. So, as the police investigation unfolded over the next few days, the officers kept an eye on Roy, just to check his behavior. You might not be surprised to hear, he was very interested in the case. He was always outside his home trying to get a word on what was happening. The strangest part was when the officers returned to his house for further questions.
Why do y'all keep coming to me for? Well, I was trying to calm you. I was trying to calm you down.
I know my property. I'm not bothering you. I don't bother nobody. I stay with myself.
Do you still have my phone number?
Yes, I have it. And I told him out there, they repeatedly kept on. I have his number. I know his name and everything.
Right.
And then they come up here and ask me the same question.
Usually people are okay with helping the police with an ongoing investigation. Was Roy reluctant because of his many run-ins with the police? Or was there something more that he was agitated about? His aggressive behavior made the officers even more apprehensive about him, and they began studying his behavior even more closely. Before long, they noticed that he was always peeking in the direction of Johanna's place.
Anytime that you're on the scene of one of those crimes and the police are there for a long time, you're gonna have your looky-loos. You're gonna have your people that kind of stand around and watch. But there was something about Roy Coons that stood out to the female officer. She was the second officer that arrived on the scene, and she went, I feel like I need to go talk to him.
Of course, this infuriated Roy even more, but an officer put it quite plainly to him.
If you had a 12-year-old daughter that was killed, would you or would you not want us to do everything that we possibly can to find out what took place?
What happened down there? The daughter got killed? I know them, man.
Even after 2 or 3 days of intense staring at the scene, Roy acted like he didn't know what really happened 2 doors down. Still, he was really upset about the police pestering him every single day.
Are you agitated because of the horrors of what happened in your neighborhood? That's completely logical. But at the same token, you do have to recognize that law enforcement does need to do their job and conduct an investigation. Why can't you just provide the basic information needed so we can eliminate you as a suspect and move on to the next person?
Indeed, it would have been much easier for Roy to calmly answer the officers' questions and wish them a good day. It was precisely his standoffish behavior that got them back to his place. Eventually, they asked him directly if he had anything to do with the murder of Yhoana Arteaga.
Oh man, I'm not getting involved in that. I got enough going on.
And the only reason we want to talk to you a little more is because you were home a little more than everybody else.
And like I said, I'm inside most of the time. I don't come out because I know how I am.
Right.
And I get riled up.
Just keep my number.
I got your number.
And it changes.
If I see anything or hear anything at all,
I'll call.
I will.
What did Roy mean when he said he knows how he is? Short-tempered? A criminal? One can only guess. What's clear is that at that time he was a 45-year-old living with his parents who didn't hold a steady job and spent most of his time inside his home. By now he was suspicious enough for the police to want some DNA evidence from his place. So they simply picked up one of the cigarette butts that he'd thrown out onto his front lawn.
If you find something that has been discarded, there will be some element of you perhaps left behind. And what finer example of this than a cigarette butt? You're touching the exterior of the cigarette. But more importantly, you're essentially inoculating and introducing your saliva into the filter.
Yucky, but useful. So the cigarette butt was sent to the lab and a DNA profile was drafted to be compared with the DNA found at the crime scene. It's about to get much more complicated before it gets any easier. As the police took more of an interest in Roy Coons Jr., they start asking him more direct questions about the killer's potential motive.
I mean, I really don't know that much to put an idea on what happened or, what they had going on, or if you go into the house and she, surprised them. But I mean, even then, still, that wouldn't make no sense if you want to turn a burglary into a murder. I guess it's one of those things you just have to put yourself in that situation to find out.
It sounds like he's talking about a botched robbery. Someone waited for the family to leave the house so that they could sneak in and steal their valuables. But they didn't know the little daughter would be home, so they panicked and attacked her. This would make sense, but did Roy know more about this, or was he just throwing ideas at the cops? When the detectives asked him about his whereabouts the day of the murder, he said he only went out to get cigarettes and then to walk a friend's dog. Then they asked him about his last interaction with Patricia or her kids. As it turns out, Roy would sometimes cut her lawn.
Have you been inside since Patricia wanted? Just the doorway. I was here Monday. When I went down there and asked her about the lawnmower, she got the lawnmower. And then a couple times prior to that.
Of course, this question was only leading the police to the next one, since they were awaiting results from the lab.
Is there any reason that we could ever possibly find her DNA on her? I mean, I've shook her hand and stuff like that.
But when the results came back from the lab, there was a DNA match that was much more concerning than a handshake. Roy's DNA was found on the back of a windowsill at Johanna's home. It was also found on a shirt, a sock. Then a YSTR match was found on Johanna's cheek, her left arm, and her bottom. However, his DNA wasn't on the martial arts belt that was used as the murder weapon. Also, none of the prints found at the crime scene matched his. So that was sending pretty mixed signals to the police.
It's very difficult many times to find a latent print, or we don't have prints on the ends of our fingers. These are easily obliterated. You got to keep in mind, and this is quite fascinating, the day after the homicide, Coons was actually walking down the road and there was a police officer that was there. One of the things that the police officer noticed is that Coons had latex gloves hanging out of his pocket during that interaction.
Yet another red flag. He was seen with gloves, left no prints, yet left DNA inside the house, when he claimed he'd never been inside. Still, the police decided to ask him if he'd seen any suspicious people around the area in the days leading up to Johanna's murder.
Can't see any strange vehicles out here.
There was two Mexicans down there down there fighting. And one of them was in a truck, a big custom truck or something, and came up this way. There's a green time to go to the truck. And every time he comes up down through there, he almost stops real slow.
This sounded almost silly, but the officers couldn't dismiss it, especially since there were other prints at the scene. So at the very least, they thought Roy was involved in something strange with another couple of people, and he was trying to get out of it by throwing them under the bus.
There were other profiles of other men's DNA that were found on that scene, in that room, and on her body.
While the police were trying to uncover just what went on between Roy, Johanna, and perhaps other suspects, Roy's dad was fiercely defending him on TV.
I know him better than that, and he ain't the type to do that. Well, they come in like a herd of buffaloes, machine guns, both sides, round through there, round through here.
By now, Roy Coons Jr. was officially a suspect, and the police even told the news that they had DNA evidence linking him to the crime.
Scientific evidence analyzed by both the Metro Police Department and the TBI crime laboratories was crucial in this investigation.
Gathering information from the family and other neighbors, it was pretty clear to the police that Roy had never been introduced to Johanna. He'd only cut the family's grass a few times, and he'd only shaken hands with Patricia. There was no reason why his DNA would be inside the house. And yet, the more he spoke to the police, the more Roy seemed appalled by the idea of killing an innocent child.
I wouldn't kill a child if somebody had a gun. I'm not gonna let you take that child. And if I had some kind of knowledge, you know, I would have done what I had to do to protect her if it cost me harm.
Remember this, he said he would have given his life to protect Johanna from her killer. And when the officer asked him what he thinks should happen to the killer, Roy replied,
Whatever happened to her should happen to me. I would pretty much make sure that they endure whatever my child is.
Then, Roy Coons made a big mistake. You know how police investigators often let suspects talk and talk until they dig their own holes? When the detective fell silent, Roy filled the void.
You know, like I was telling you yesterday, Miss Joe's sister-in-law doesn't take her.
Buzz! This information had not been released to the public, and there was no way whichever family member he mentioned would have known these details. The sexual assault and strangulation had not been talked about. The only ones who knew about this were Johanna's family. And like in any police case, they didn't talk to anyone about this, as sharing such details can lead to a botched investigation.
First off, he was hanging around, and now he has intimate knowledge of a scene, something that no one else has had eyes on.
But even this wasn't enough evidence to arrest Roy Coons Jr. As retired detective Melissa Pinkleton would say, people often overhear such details, even though the police try to contain them.
And I used to work on Dickerson Road, and it's filled with apartment complexes and trailer parks. And when you get on a scene like that, I know that the police say it wasn't out there, but people are talking. I do believe it's possible that it could have been overheard and the game of telephone got played that, oh, she was strangled and raped.
Finally, weeks after Johanna's murder, the police decided to look into her phone conversations. That's when Johanna became the hero of her own story. When the detectives checked Johanna's last messages, they discovered her very last conversation with her mother. At 4:15 p.m. on August 10th, Johanna wrote to Patricia,
Mom, someone is knocking on the door. And then at 4:19, the victim wrote back to her mother, I think it was the man who cuts the yard.
Who cut their yard? That's right, Roy Coons Jr. Johanna's message was the only bit of evidence stating that Roy had been at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder.
Text message is a huge component. It puts him there. It puts him in contact with her right around the time that she was murdered.
Now, the whole gruesome picture was becoming clear. Roy Coons was a predator, someone who lurked around the house, waiting for the adults to leave so he could enter. Someone who knew their schedule, who had been stalking them for a long time before he made the final step. In September 2017, Roy Coons Jr. was arrested and charged with the murder and attempted rape of Yhoana Arteaga. Funnily enough, Roy himself had given the police advice on how to catch him.
I think the best way is for us to find a person who will look at it.
Technology. I mean, pretty much everybody around here, it's either who knows people wasn't home or wasn't nothing saw or heard, so it's left up to technology guys work. You know, and they got to put a lot of hours in, they can't arrest.
As soon as the news of his arrest got to the Tennessee community, they weren't surprised.
Day one. I seen him out mowing yards thinking, he's got the nerve.
Apparently, Margaret, another one of Patricia's neighbors, had met Roy during Johanna's vigil.
I walked over and I put a candle in his hand, and all he did was drop his head and walked away. My gut feeling was, he's got a guilty conscience.
Roy wasn't the only one with a guilty conscience. The Tennessee police were too. He'd been arrested 100 times. How come he was roaming free after all his parole violations, able to rob and kill?
I don't think there's a member of this police department that's not troubled by the fact that when we arrest people, that very, very often for violent crimes, that they have been arrested many times before and convicted, but are yet on the streets.
Pretty much everyone was glad Roy Coons Jr. was in custody, held without bail, perhaps apart from his family. But his trial wasn't a straightforward one. There was a big issue. There were no witnesses who could confirm that Roy was at Johanna's home that day, nor was there any physical evidence apart from the dubious DNA inside the house.
DNA YSTR profile on the right cheek, on the right buttocks, and it was the exact same YSTR profile as Roy Coons Jr.
This was all circumstantial evidence. In many cases, this wouldn't have been enough to convict someone, even if the charge is murder. His defense team was pretty aggressive.
You're not going to hear from a single eyewitness that Mr. Coons went in that mobile home on that day. You're not going to see any video footage from security cameras showing that he did that. You're not going to hear from any witnesses that he had any motive or had attempted to do anything to this family in the past.
The attorney also argued that the DNA was just a few cells, no bodily fluids that could link him to attempted sexual assault or murder. But in Roy's case, the circumstantial evidence was pretty overwhelming. Remember that comment he made to the investigators?
He knows that Johanna has been strangled. That information was not public at the time the defendant knew it.
There were also Johanna's damning messages.
4:19 p.m. she identifies that the man who was knocking on the door of her trailer that day was the man who cuts the lawn. All the proof you've heard has shown that Roy Coons was the man who cut their lawn at that trailer.
Then there was the final nail to the cross. After killing Johanna, Roy ran off to a homeless shelter not far away from the trailer park. Feeling safe from the police and the community in his neighborhood, Roy started talking to a man there.
He just asked me if I ever killed somebody. I didn't ask him if he ever did, but he told me he has. He didn't tell me who he was or how long he was, but he said he did, this is his what, that sticks with you, that's what he said. I was so freaked out. I never get scared.
Yeah. Imagine hearing that from a stranger who happens to be living with you. Moses was unaware of the investigation, but when he learned about it, he stepped forward as a witness. And that was the last witness the jury needed to wrap the case.
He's got this burden, this thing that gnaws at him. He's sleeping in a wooded area not too far away from the victim, and I think that tells you a lot.
Now a psychological profile was complete. This was Roy Coons' first murder, and he couldn't act cool about it. He couldn't get over it. He had a guilty conscience, and he felt obligated to tell someone about it. On July 15th, 2019, the jury had a clear verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant Ronald Donald Coons Jr. in count 1, guilty of second-degree murder. Count 2, felony murder, guilty.
Roy was just about shedding a tear, but it was way too late for that. And tragically, these weren't tears of remorse. He was just sad he'd lost his freedom. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 25 years. In 2020, Roy Coons appeared on the news again at a trial for the sexual assault of Yhoana Arteaga. Just listen to what he told Patricia.
I can't apologize for a crime I didn't commit, but I will say I'm sorry for your loss.
Imagine showing zero remorse even after years in prison. He was going to spend life in prison anyway. Did he really think a lie would overrule his sentence now? On the other hand, Patricia spoke about how losing her daughter in such a heinous way changed her life forever.
Everything has changed. Our lives have changed completely.
Patricia still cries every day, as she cannot forget the day she returned home with her 2 children and found Johanna the way that she did. You can't forget and you can't forgive something like this. Meanwhile, people remember Johanna at vigils and hope that such terrible things won't ever happen again.
We gotta help them. We gotta help Johanna's family.
But it's a strange world, and we have to always be on the lookout. Thanks for watching, you guys. Hey, don't be shy. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. See you next time, and stay safe.